The night was silent over Belarus, the 18th of March, 1943. The snow-covered pines stood motionless beneath a pale moon, their branches heavy with frost and the weight of war. Somewhere in the woods, near the small village of Khatyn, the sound of boots broke the stillness. German boots, moving fast, methodically, with purpose. Behind them came the low hum of trucks, the faint metallic rattle of weapons, and the ragged breathing of men driven by rage. What had begun as a routine patrol would end as one of the most haunting massacres on the Eastern Front, an act of vengeance that would claim an entire village and stain forever the name of the man whose death sparked it. Hans Woellke. Just hours earlier, Woellke, a national hero of Nazi Germany, had been alive and laughing. The 1936 Berlin Olympic champion, whose broad smile once symbolized Aryan triumph before Adolf Hitler himself, now wore the uniform of an SS officer. Once a celebrated athlete, he had become a captain in the Panikt Ordnungspolizei, commanding units that hunted partisans across occupied Belarus. For years, Nazi propaganda had held him up as the embodiment of German strength and racial superiority. But that March evening, on a lonely forest road near the hamlet of Pleshchenitsy, fate ambushed him in the form of 3 Soviet partisans armed with rifles in desperation. The attack was swift and brutal. His convoy, a few vehicles winding through the darkness, came under sudden fire. Bullets shattered windshields. One hit Woellke's chest. Witnesses later described how the hero of the Berlin Games, the man who once threw the shot put farther than any man alive, collapsed in the snow, his blood spreading like ink across the white ground. The Germans fought back, but the ambushers vanished into the woods. By dawn, word of Woellke's death reached his superiors, and what followed was no longer war, it was vengeance. Hans Woellke's death struck the Nazi command like a personal insult to Hitler himself. Woellke was not just a soldier, he was a national symbol. In 1936, his victory in shot put had made him the first German athlete to win Olympic gold at those games, an event Hitler used to glorify his ideology of Aryan dominance. His fame endured long after the stadium cheers faded. He toured schools, appeared in newsreels, and was photographed shaking hands with Hitler, Goebbels, and Goering. When he joined the SS and was posted to Belarus, it was both a propaganda gesture and a reward. To the German High Command, his presence on the Eastern Front carried symbolic weight, the hero among soldiers, the golden athlete, now waging Hitler's racial war. So when the partisans killed him, the Germans decided that someone would pay. Orders were issued to a nearby detachment of the Schutzmannschaft auxiliary police units composed largely of local collaborators under German control. Their mission was simple and merciless: find the attackers and make an example of the region so terrifying that no one would ever dare touch a German officer again. At dawn, the men surrounded Khatyn, a small farming village of just over 150 residents, mostly women, children, and the elderly. The villagers had nothing to do with Woellke's ambush. Their only crime was proximity. The soldiers herded everyone into the central square. Mothers clutched their children. Old men leaned on sticks. A translator shouted accusations. The villagers had harbored partisans. They were traitors, spies, enemies of the Reich. The villagers denied it, but denial meant nothing now. The soldiers ordered them all into a large wooden barn on the edge of town. Some villagers tried to flee, but machine gun bursts cut them down. Once the doors were sealed, the troops stacked hay and firewood against the walls and doused it with kerosene. Then they lit the match. The flames rose fast. Screams filled the morning air as the barn turned into an inferno. The soldiers stood outside, rifles ready, shooting anyone who tried to break through the burning walls. The snow melted into red mud beneath their boots. By the time it was over, 149 people lay dead, 75 of them children. Only a handful survived, including a young boy named Joseph Kaminski, who crawled from the wreckage to find his father's charred body still holding him. That single survivor would later testify to the horror that consumed his village. For the Germans, the massacre was routine, another reprisal in a war that had turned entire regions into graveyards. But for history, it marked a grotesque turning point. The murder of Hans Woellke had become the justification for mass murder. In Berlin, Nazi propaganda spun the event as the righteous fury of soldiers avenging their fallen hero. In reality, it exposed the fragile vanity of the regime's myth-making. The man who had once symbolized strength and discipline had now become the cause of barbarity and destruction. News of Khatyn filtered slowly. Through the fog of war, Soviet reporters documented the ruins after the Red Army recaptured the area in 1944. The entire village had been erased, only ashes. Scorched iron tools and blackened stones remained. The barn's outline was still visible in the ground, a silent monument to rage. For every Khatyn, there were hundreds of others. The Nazi policy of reprisal, one German life equals 100 locals, turned entire communities into tombs. By the end of the war, more than 600 Belarusian villages had been destroyed in similar fashion. Khatyn became a symbol for them all. Yet even after his death, Hans Woellke's story refused to fade. The Germans posthumously praised him as a martyr, awarding him the Iron Cross. His name appeared in military bulletins, his Olympic footage reissued with solemn music. To many in the Reich, his death was proof of German sacrifice on the Eastern Front. But in the ashes of Khatyn, his legacy twisted into something darker. The man who once represented victory now represented vengeance. His gold medal, once a symbol of pride, now glimmered with the reflection of fire. As the years passed, historians struggled to untangle myth from reality. Woellke had never ordered atrocities himself, but his status made him inseparable from the system that did. He had been part of the Ordnungspolizei, units directly implicated in anti-partisan sweeps, deportations, and executions. Whether he believed in the ideology or simply served it, his death became the spark for a massacre that would echo through generations. In the archives of both Germany and Belarus, his name appears in two vastly different lights: hero and villain, victim and catalyst. When the Soviet Union built the Khatyn Memorial in 1969, they did not name Woellke, but his shadow hung over every stone. At its center stood symbolic chimneys marking the vanished homes, each crowned with a bronze bell that tolled every 30 seconds, a reminder that somewhere, someone once lived there. The figure of a father holding his dead child stands in silence, embodying the survivor's grief. To the visitors who came, the question was always the same: how could one man's death lead to the extermination of so many? Hans Woellke's execution, sudden, unplanned, meaningless in the chaos of war, had unleashed a fury that killed not just a village, but the illusion of honor in conquest. His story stands as a cruel paradox of the Third Reich, that its heroes, born in stadiums of glory, ended in fields of fire. And as the war dragged on, that paradox only deepened. For the Nazi regime, Woellke's death became a rallying cry. For the people of Belarus, it became a curse. But deeper questions remained unanswered, waiting to unfold: who truly gave the order for Khatyn? Why did the death of one man ignite the death of thousands more? And how did a single bullet in the snow become the spark for 13,000 civilian deaths across occupied Belarus in the weeks that followed? The answers would emerge from the smoke of revenge, in the dark machinery of Nazi occupation, where every atrocity had a trigger and every hero had a shadow. At dawn the following day, the fires in Khatyn were still burning. Smoke drifted lazily through the blackened ruins, mixing with the sharp scent of scorched wood and human ash. German patrols moved through the rubble methodically, boots crunching over bone and embers, rifles slung casually across their shoulders. For them, it was just another operation, another cleansing. But this one had a name attached, a justification whispered in every report: revenge for Hans Woellke. His death had become a rallying point, a spark that lit a wave of terror across occupied Belarus. What began as retribution for a single officer's ambush soon turned into an orchestrated bloodletting, consuming village after village in fire. Within hours of Woellke's death, orders had spread across the region under the command of SS and police leader Kurt von Gottberg. Von Gottberg had built his reputation on brutality. He believed fear was the only language civilians understood. To him, Woellke's killing was not just an affront, it was an opportunity. He mobilized the infamous Durlavanger Brigade and the 118th Schutzmannschaft Battalion, composed largely of Ukrainian and Belarusian collaborators. Their mission was simple: root out partisans, burn suspected villages, and eliminate anyone who might have aided the ambushers. In reality, it was open season on the innocent. These units were monsters, even by Nazi standards. The Durlavanger men, convicts, poachers, and sadists released from prisons to fight for the Reich, moved like locusts, leaving nothing behind but ash. Under von Gottberg's orders, more than 100 villages were destroyed in the following weeks. The pattern was identical: surround the village, drive civilians into barns or schools, set them ablaze, and shoot those who tried to flee. Each massacre was logged as anti-partisan activity, written in cold, bureaucratic language that stripped away horror. When the numbers were totaled, more than 13,000 civilians were dead: farmers, mothers, children. The official record simply listed them as neutralized. In the Reich's propaganda offices, Hans Woellke's name appeared again not as an athlete, but as a fallen martyr of the German nation. Pamphlets circulated among soldiers and civilians alike, describing how the beloved Olympic hero had been treacherously murdered by Bolshevik bandits. His image, smiling, blonde, powerful, became the face of vengeance. Newspapers declared, "The Führer's champion has been avenged." Few questioned how many corpses that vengeance required. To the men carrying torches into villages, it didn't matter. Their orders came from above, their rage sanctified by myth. Behind this machinery of retaliation, the Nazi occupation's command structure functioned with terrifying precision. Reports flowed upward from the field to headquarters in Minsk. Each massacre had its paperwork: how many houses destroyed, how many partisans killed, how many weapons recovered. Though most partisans were unarmed civilians, the documents painted a picture of efficiency and order, masking chaos and cruelty. Typists in crisp uniforms filed them neatly, stamping each with official seals. The violence was industrial, not emotional, and yet its origins traced back to one dead athlete on a snowy road. Technically, the killing of Woellke had been an accident of war. The partisans hadn't even known whom they were ambushing. Soviet archives later revealed that the attack was a random strike against German vehicles, part of routine sabotage operations. But in the Nazi mindset, coincidence didn't exist, only conspiracy. Woellke was too valuable a symbol to die meaninglessly. His death required narrative, and that narrative demanded blood. The result was what historians now call the Khatyn massacres, a campaign of annihilation designed not to destroy armies, but to erase communities. As the fires spread, so did fear. Word reached distant villages. The Germans were avenging a dead officer. People fled into forests, living in pits and root cellars, too terrified to light fires. Entire districts became wastelands. The Soviet partisans, far from being crushed, gained sympathy and recruits. For every village destroyed, new fighters emerged from the ashes, vowing revenge. The Germans could burn homes, but they could not burn memory. In Berlin, Hans Woellke's image continued to adorn posters, but the man himself had long ceased to matter. What mattered was the myth. His Olympic triumph in Berlin, that single shining moment in 1936 when he threw the shot put beyond all rivals, was now reinterpreted as proof of the German spirit. Propaganda films replayed the footage alongside scenes of marching soldiers and burning villages, suggesting that his legacy lived on in their cleansing of Bolshevism. It was perverse sport repurposed into slaughter, heroism weaponized into hatred. The engineers of death who orchestrated the massacres, documented their work meticulously. Train schedules ensured ammunition and fuel reached the killing zones on time. Signal operators coordinated unit movements by radio. Armored cars patrolled the forest roads to seal escape routes. Everything operated like a machine, efficient, precise, mechanical. The same organizational genius that had once built autobahns and Olympic stadiums now built cremation grounds across Eastern Europe. Among those overseeing the reprisals was Oskar Dirlewanger himself, a man whose cruelty was whispered about even among the SS. Survivors recalled his laughter as barns burned, his pleasure in terror. Under his command, the villages of Wieleka, Dokshici, and Krasny Bereg vanished one after another. Entire populations were shot or burned alive. Dirlewanger later boasted in a drunken speech that, for every German officer, we take 100 enemies. The arithmetic of evil was simple. When the Red Army finally pushed westward in 1944, they found nothing left of Khatyn but a clearing. The ground was still black, the air still heavy with the scent of death. Soviet investigators began collecting testimonies, tracing the chain of command. They uncovered the names of Woellke's killers, 3 partisans, all later executed by the Germans, but the trail of responsibility for the massacres stretched far higher. Von Gottberg was captured and committed suicide before trial. Dirlewanger was beaten to death by Polish guards after the war. Yet their crimes remained etched into the soil they scorched. In post-war Germany, Hans Woellke's name reappeared, cautiously at first. Some saw him as a victim, a soldier caught in chaos. Others saw him as the match that lit a firestorm. The truth was more complicated. He had been part of the Nazi machine, an officer in uniform, serving a cause that demanded obedience over conscience. His death had meaning only because propaganda needed it to. Without that machinery, it would have been just another casualty in a brutal war. But within it, he became the symbol of vengeance, a name attached to horror. By the 1962, historians began to reassess his story. Archival documents revealed his direct role in anti-partisan operations before his death. He had not been a passive figure, nor innocent. Reports indicated that his police unit had participated in punitive raids that left villages smoldering even before his own end. The irony was cruel. The man whose murder justified massacres had already been part of that same cycle of destruction. Fate had turned its mirror on him. For the survivors of Belarus, Hans Woellke's name remained a wound. In oral histories, villagers spoke of him not as an athlete or officer, but as a curse. When he died, our world burned, one survivor said, decades later. The cause and effect blurred hero and horror fused into one. The boy who had watched his village vanish, Joseph Kaminsky, grew old, carrying that memory. When he visited the Khatyn memorial, he placed flowers not for soldiers or partisans, but for the nameless, those erased because of one man's death. In that silence, the weight of Woellke's legacy hung heavy. A single bullet had rippled outward into genocide. And yet, for all the propaganda, all the reports and rhetoric, one truth cut through it all. Revenge is blind. And when nations worship heroes, their downfall often begins in the same applause that once crowned them. But the war was far from over. The machine that consumed Khatyn would soon turn westward, leaving behind a landscape of ghosts. The vengeance that began in one forest road would end in the ashes of Berlin, and with it, the final collapse of the myth that Hans Woellke had once embodied. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Europe awoke to silence, a silence broken only by the wind over ruins and the echo of names no one dared to speak. Among them was Hans Woellke. For the Nazi regime, he had been a golden idol. For the victims of Belarus, a curse carved in fire. His story, buried beneath rubble and propaganda, emerged only in fragments. The smiling Olympian in Berlin, the officer in uniform, the corpse in the snow, and the infernos that followed. It was the story of a man transformed by ideology, and of how one death became the excuse for the death of thousands. But history, relentless and unmerciful, would not let that story rest. When Soviet investigators entered the charred remains of Khatyn in 1944, they found only silence and ash. The survivors, a few burned, half-mad villagers, spoke haltingly of German soldiers, of collaborators, of a barn filled with screams. They didn't know who Hans Woellke was. His name meant nothing to them, yet his death had defined theirs. As they sifted through the ruins, the Soviets realized Khatyn was not unique. The same pattern of destruction repeated across Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland. Over 600 villages had been erased in identical fashion. The systematic slaughter that followed Woellke's killing was only one thread in a far greater tapestry of annihilation, a war waged not against armies, but against people. In Moscow, prosecutors compiled evidence for the Nuremberg trials. Among the documents were reports linking the SS and police leadership to retaliatory massacres in occupied territories. Kurt von Gottberg's orders surfaced, detailing reprisal actions justified by enemy provocations. The murder of Woellke featured as one such provocation. It was mentioned briefly in court, a footnote to a mountain of horror, but it exposed the psychology that drove Nazi occupation. The need to turn every loss into vengeance, every death into justification for 100 more. Hans Woellke himself could not stand trial. His image, however, lingered in the archives, a photograph of him smiling beside Hitler at the 1936 Olympics. The contrast was jarring. The bright stadium, the cheering crowd, the polished medals, and then, just 7 years later, the frozen forest and the flames of Khatyn. That image encapsulated the arc of the Third Reich. From spectacle to slaughter, from glory to ashes. For years after the war, West Germany avoided his name. It was too complicated, too tainted. In East Germany, Soviet authorities ensured that the name Woellke was spoken only with disdain, not as a hero, but as the spark of atrocity. The Khatyn Memorial, unveiled in 1969, became a place of pilgrimage for Soviet citizens, a sacred ground symbolizing all villages that had perished under German occupation. The statue at its center, a towering bronze figure of a father carrying his dead son, embodied grief beyond nationality. There were no plaques for Woellke, no recognition of the man whose death had started the chain. Only bells ringing every 30 seconds, one for each lost village. The memorial's silence spoke louder than accusation. It was not only about victims, but about memory, about how nations choose to remember the causes of their suffering. For the Soviet Union, Khatyn became a moral symbol, proof of fascist barbarity. For Germany, it was an open wound, one that demanded reflection rather than denial. The name Hans Woellke slowly returned to historical study, not as a hero or a villain, but as a tragic cipher of ideology's corrosion. Historians later reconstructed his life. Born in 1911, he rose from modest beginnings to athletic fame, winning gold in Berlin with a throw of 16.2 meters, the pride of a nation obsessed with strength. He joined the police, then the SS, serving in occupied Poland and later Belarus. Witnesses described him as disciplined, patriotic, but unquestioning. In the chaos of occupation, morality dissolved into obedience. His transformation from athlete to officer mirrored Germany's descent from promise to perversion. His execution by partisans was not a grand moment of resistance, just a fleeting act in a vast war, yet it unleashed the deadliest reprisals Belarus would ever know. As archives opened in the 1990 seconds, new details emerged. Researchers found that the retaliatory operations linked to Woellke's death claimed over 13,000 lives across 100 villages. The Germans had documented everything: names, ages, numbers of eliminated households. Among them were entire families erased in seconds. The records were chillingly neat, as if genocide were an exercise in accounting. The historian's pen trembled where the typewriter had not. The legacy of Hans Woellke forced both Germany and the world to confront a painful question: How do we remember those who inspired atrocity without excusing it? Was he a victim of war or a symbol of the system that created it? The answer, perhaps, lay in understanding the machinery that surrounded him, the propaganda, the hierarchy, the ideology that turned a man into a myth and then into a weapon. Woellke's death mattered not because of who he was, but because of what others made him represent. In the machinery of the Third Reich, even a corpse could serve the cause. For Belarus, the memory endured differently. Each bell at Khatyn tolled not just for the villagers, but for every nameless child burned because someone, somewhere, demanded vengeance for a fallen officer. School children visited the memorial in silence, their teachers telling them, "This is what hatred becomes." And in that stillness, the myth of the Nazi hero collapsed entirely. Today, Hans Woellke's name survives in two histories, one of triumph, one of terror. In the archives of sports, he remains the 1936 Olympic gold medalist, the man who brought pride to his nation. In the archives of war, he is the dead officer whose execution triggered the murder of thousands. The dissonance is unbearable, yet essential, for it reveals the true nature of totalitarianism, the ability to turn glory into guilt and men into instruments of destruction. When modern visitors walk through Khatyn's memorial field, the bells still chime through the pine forest. The bronze faces stare forward, unblinking. The air carries no smell of smoke now, only the sound of wind over names carved in stone. Each ring of the bell recalls the moment that changed everything: the shot in the forest, the fire in the barn, the death of the hero who became the harbinger of tragedy. And so, Hans Woellke's legacy remains suspended between two worlds: the cheers of the Olympic Stadium and the silence of the mass grave. His story warns that greatness without conscience can become tyranny, and pride without empathy can turn to cruelty. In war, even heroes bleed, but when their blood feeds vengeance, it stains generations. As night falls over Khatyn, the bells ring once more. Each toll is a reminder that history does not forget, even when men try to. Somewhere in that sound lies the ghost of a man who once believed he represented strength and the echo of thousands who paid the price for that illusion. In the end, Hans Woellke's life and death teach a grim truth: that no symbol, no medal, no victory can survive the fire it helps ignite. The village is gone, the hero is gone, but the echo of both endures a warning to every age that worships power without mercy.